Friday the 13th, Carnival of Maniacs, Chapter 6. Imagine 10 different aircraft from 10 different nations, in 10 different periods in history. Now fill the planes with furniture from their respective zones of departure and crash them all on top of a single ranch house. Welcome to the home of Nosferatu. It had taken 6 years for the rock star to finish designing his Beverly Hills pied-à-terre, a place where minimalism, medievalism, functionalism, and any other damnal-ism he liked all combined to form the world's most expensive vomit. Ask Ross to name the concept, and he'd have called it European, even though he would be hard-pushed to find anyone from Europe prepared to live in such a tasteless mishmash of shit. But then what did Ross care? If he wanted to spend a few $100K on a piece of Chippendale to put next to his Elvis standee, then he would. He wasn't asking anyone else to live there. And besides, his place was no different from his neighbors, not even those pretentious actors who insisted on rhyming pasta with Costa. Anyone who was anyone in town, they all lived in their own grotesque versions of Fort Knox. The upkeep of Castle Ferratu, however, was left to Jaomi. She handled the caterers, the chauffeur, the pool boy, all that crap, and Ross let her do whatever she wanted with the lawns. In fact, he pretty much gave her the run of the place. The only rooms she couldn't enter without his permission were the den, where he chilled, the studio where he rocked, and the office where he did business. 2 fiancés, a former wife, and countless staff had all been kicked into touch for breaking that one inviolable commandment. Ross's unscheduled guest, however, had just been asked to wait in the office by the singer personally. Luke Varanti sipped at his bourbon and let his eyes roam around Ferratu's inner sanctum. The place looked like an old-fashioned library. It was all wood paneling and brass desk lamps and fittings. One wall was taken up by an overstuffed bookcase, while the other 3 were covered with framed photos, documents, and front pages from old newspapers. Luke noticed a 1984 edition of the Wessex County Register, the headline reading, "Mass Murderer's Body Missing." Then he looked to the left and saw a smeary black and white photo of someone wearing a hockey mask. Next to that was a driving license belonging to some guy named Charles McCulloch. The document was genuine, and it had what looked like dried blood stains on it. But who the hell was Charles McCulloch? Luke got up and went over to browse through the books. There were hundreds of them, and they were all about murder, specifically the Crystal Lake murders. One shelf alone he saw, Jason Voorhees' Fact or Fiction. Camp Crystal Lake, The Bloody Truth. The Man Behind the Machete. The Springwood Copycat Killer. Who's Afraid of the Water? Mommy Made Him Do It. 6 other books had all been written by some cash-in merchant named Thomas Jarvis. Admiring the collection, Luke turned and saw Ross standing in the doorway. "Fuck!" squawked Varanti. "You nearly gave me a bypass." Ross closed the door and helped himself to a vodka from the drinks table. In the flesh, Ross was surprisingly tall and attractive, in a curiously dysfunctional way, like a police identikit picture, with insufficient room for the features, though his hair, of course, was modeled on Jason circa 1984. Unusually for someone in his profession, he didn't have a single tattoo, and when he was off duty, he didn't put on a lick of makeup, not even eye pencil. Instead, he just bummed around in what looked like shop clothes, tough khakis like the kind worn by his screwed-up Crystal Lake idol. Ross dropped some ice in his glass and sat down behind a massive antique desk. "And what do I owe the pleasure of your delightful company?" he asked. Luke pointed at the smudged photo of the man in the hockey mask. "I thought you said this was fake?" "It is. Tyrone Pulley, a farmer from Blairstown, New Jersey. But it looks kind of cool. No one's got any photos of the real deal." "You don't say?" snickered Varanti. "Hey." Luke's skepticism never failed to annoy Ross. "I had tickets for the turnbuckle action at Staples tonight. So come on, what is it that can't wait?" There were 3 plush leather armchairs angled in front of Ross's desk. Luke parked his ass in one of them. "Okay," said Varanti. "Do you want the shite news or the double shite?" Nice suit you're wearing. Ross wasn't enjoying Luke's attitude at all. The compliment was a not-so-subtle warning to Veronti that, before he opened his mouth, he needed to remember who was paying the bills. Wish I could say the same about you, Veronti shot back. I could do with someone to check the fucking oil. Okay, it's a tie. Ross sipped at his white spirit. He should have known by now not to spar with an Irishman like Veronti. So what's pissing on my parade today? He stared across the desk at Luke and readied himself for the worst. Veronti was 5'2" of compacted bile. He never wore anything but black. Black roll-neck sweater, sharp black suit, patent shoes. He was never out of black sunglasses, and his dyed black hairline was permanently sculpted in the shape of Ayers Rock. He was also president of Veronti Entertainment, Ross's manager, and one hard-nosed son-of-a-bitch Irishman. Okay, bad news first. Your album's dead. Ross choked and spat liquor across the mahogany. What the fuck do you mean? It's only been out a week. Trust me, Luke replied in an accent that had stepped off a boat halfway back home. The sales curve's fallen faster than the WTC. Internet, retail, MP3. I say you're fucked, laddie. The news was so unexpected. Ross found himself giggling. Okay, sure, but, okay. Well, what's the really bad news? I'm canceling the tour. Ross stopped laughing. You're yanking my chain, he hoped. No, I can't book you anywhere. But I've always been good for the arenas. My stage show, it's a crock of 80s horse shite, where you go bumping around in the dark like some egg-faced prick. That's what your fucking stage show is. It's like your fucking albums. It's just one big crock of shite. Like all this bullshit you got in here. It's all about your fucking Eggman with his big fat fucking chopper. Ross jumped to his feet. Hey, don't talk about my Jason like that. Or what? Challenged Veronti. You'll dress your wife like him and take her up the arse? Oh, I forgot. You already did that in your last promo video. Fright Day 13, began Ross. Sucks shite, finished his manager. Half the stations won't carry it, 'cause there's too much blood on our rockets, and the other half have buried it in the jack-off slot. We got 0 uplifts in sales. Do you hear that, Ross? 0. Ross hurled the tumbler across the room. It smashed against a life-size mannequin of Jason that stood over in the far corner, away from the light. The design of the effigy was based on the most reliable eyewitness reports. Wrong answer, Luke, he shouted. Do you want to come with me to the studio? I don't need to see your studio. Take a look at my gold fucking discs. I'm not interested in your discs. 7 platinum. I know a guy in the nickel who makes them $20 a piece. A whole fucking wall papered in music industry awards. My dog's got no nose. How does he smell? He doesn't. He just follows all the other bitches. Ross walked over to look at his framed Voorhees memorabilia. For all his millions, all he had were newspaper cuttings, photos, stuff that everybody owned. He'd gotten into the collector's market too late, and about the only unique original he possessed was a McCulloch driving license. Big deal. He kept his back to Luke as he spoke. I've had 7 albums. They've all sold millions. He tried to sound calm, but his voice was brittle with anxiety. The 8th one can't just fell off the map. It doesn't work that way. I have an audience. Luke laughed. Only he didn't laugh as most people would, because Luke Veronti had no humor in him at all. He just made a noise, a harsh rasping sound with all the joy throttled out of it. Hardcore fucking lunatics who go around wearing Timothy McVeigh t-shirts. He chuckled. That's your fucking audience. A few 100,000 tops. With everyone else, you were just fashionable. Times change. The new kids don't give a fuck about 80s Eggman. Ross turned and clenched his fists. Jason, not an egg. Oh, scary laddie, Luke sniggered. Then he nodded at the tall Jason dummy standing in the corner. Gonna get your friend to do me over easy? Again, that rodent scrape of a laugh drove Ross crazy. He was desperate to throw a tantrum, but knew Veronti would claim it as another interpersonal victory. Okay, said Ross, trying a new angle of attack. If you're not bullshitting, if the figures really are as bad as you say, then it's gotta be the marketing. Veronti fixed him with a cold stare. It's got to be the what? Weak management. Ross emphasized each syllable of his spanking new missile. Weak management? Luke smiled with the charm of a mafia hitman. Weak management, repeated the Jasonophile, rapidly gaining confidence. You need to use some more force, Luke. Veronti groaned. I don't believe you just said that to me. Suddenly the singer walked across the office, opened the door, and shouted, Jaomi! And now Veronti really groaned. Just what I fucking need. Now you gotta call in Yoko for backup? While they waited for Miss Ferratu to show up, Ross sat down in one of the two vacant armchairs, the one facing Veronti, which left the middle seat free. She needs to hear this, said Ross with exemplary neuroticism. I'll tell you what she needs, muttered Luke. You're so fucking obsessed with that egg-faced prick you even dress your wife like him. What the fuck is wrong with you, boy? She's a top-class model. Why don't you fuck her naked like any normal guy? The subject of Luke's rant jogged into the room. Jaomi Morantes was the kind of woman every guy imagined when whacking off, but would never actually meet in real life. She had a blank slate perfection that men could plant their fantasies on, giving her an almost interactive beauty. To see Jaomi was to buy into her, and no one likes to walk away from an investment empty-handed. Much as he hated her, Luke gave her the once-over as she trapezed in and took the middle chair. She was wearing a pink racerback bra top and black baggy workout pants with a white stripe and drawstring. She flicked her long blonde hair and gathered her legs up onto the seat. What's wrong, Dwayne? Fuck, Ross whined. Jaomi, how many times? She immediately realized her faux pas. Sorry, Ross. Veronti squeaked in amusement. Don't mind me. I write the contracts, remember? It's in black and white. Dwayne fucking Weintraub, deceased. Deceased? She asked. What does that mean? It means, said Ross, that my wonderful supportive manager here seems to think I can't sell records anymore. It means he's hero to zeroed my fucking ass. Hey, snapped Veronti. I've always supported you. You lose 80%, I lose 80%. That's how it works. My job's to manage your career, and that's why I'm telling you to lose the fucking egg. Ross threw back his head and placed his palms of his hands over his eyes. He's killing me, Jaomi. He wants me to drop Jason. You can't do that. She was shocked that Luke could even consider such heresy. I know. Ross displayed the kind of despair normally reserved for daytime soap. Jason's my muse, my inspiration, I owe him everything. Then you better hope he's not real, cracked Veronti, or he'll Chapter 11 your arse in unpaid royalties. Jaomi was far from impressed with Ross's manager. That's right, Veronti. You just sit there and make jokes. That's what we pay you 20% for. We? Queried Veronti with a puzzled smile. Funny, Jaomi, but I don't recall offering to represent you. Sure, I've seen your movies. Apocalypse Now is one of my all-time favorites, but my operation doesn't have the facility to handle your level of talent. I said it from day one, Veronti. It was Jaomi who now got up to fetch herself a vodka. You're a total spunk nut. Luke nodded, then he glared at the floor. You gonna let her talk to me like that, boy? Jason stays, answered Ross firmly. If the egg stays, threatened Luke, then I don't. The two men stared at each other, and Jaomi stared at the two of them. The good, the bad, and the indifferent. It was Veronti who broke the silence. Then I quit. Without saying another word, he knocked back his drink, got up, and walked out of the room. You leave now, Ross called after him, And you don't come back. Not now, not ever. Let him go, sniped Naomi. I've seen this coming a long time. The guy's a loser, just like the way he dresses. He rolls around L.A. like a fucking SWAT munchkin. I mean it, Ross shouted, ignoring her. Luke slammed the front door on his way out. Jason's body went rolling and sliding at incredible speed along the asphalt, his limbs flailing as if on the receiving end of 50,000 volts. His mask slammed repeatedly against the paving. His torso bounced and kicked against the road. His neck jerked and snapped in 3 different places, and the severed head of Pamela was sent spinning out of his grasp. When Jason lifted Glow up her feet, the girl thought it was going to be the end of her. But paradoxically, it had saved her life. The RV had crashed into Jason, and his colossal form had absorbed most of the impact, while Glow had merely been flung to one side. Her body projected with such force that the only time she felt the ground was when she landed on it. She came down in the undergrowth just beyond the edge of the far side of the road. Luckily, the vegetation was so thick that it cushioned her fall. She didn't seem to have anything broken. All the same, when the girl tried to sit up, she found she could hardly move. Her head was aching, she felt dizzy and confused, and there was ringing in her ears. She guessed from the first aid module of her survival course that she first probably had mild concussion. So she followed what she could remember of her training and lay still for a moment. Then she took a couple of deep breaths and promptly passed out. "Alice!" gasped George. A sheen of perspiration coated his forehead, and he was shaking all over. "That was a man! You just run over someone!" The accident should have worked on Alice like a cold shower, but she'd had far too much liquor to think straight. "Shut up!" she slurred, struggling to unfasten her seatbelt. "I warned you," the old man chided. "I told you you'd get someone killed." Alice turned and slapped her dad across the face. "I thought I told you to shut up." The blow was weak and poorly aimed, yet it couldn't have hurt Whitney more than if it had come from a heavyweight champion. You hit me," he stammered. "There's no time for this." She fumbled with the door handle. "We've got to check." She pushed her way out. The old man unbuckled and went after his daughter, only to find the convoy in disarray. Behind Alice, the other drivers had done their best to respond to her emergency braking, but it still resulted in an Olympian game of jack straws scattered along the road. On the plus side, none of the trucks had collided, and it soon became clear that no one else had been injured. "What's going on?" asked Sparks, the first of the showmen to chamber out of his vehicle. He headed towards Alice's trailer to see exactly what had happened, but the woman quickly got in his path. "I want you all back in your trucks," she called. Even so, the guys kept coming, gathering in a bunch in front of her. What's this?" she drawled. "Did you form a union or something?" "We just want to know what happened," Sparks said, in a nasal that could only have come from Boston. "Is there a problem?" asked Judge nervously. The poor lamb seemed terrified. In fact, the more time Alice spent with these guys, the more she realized they were just a bunch of college kids. "No," said Alice. "No problem. We just hit an animal, that's all." Judge took out his cell. "Maybe we should call a vet?" Alice ran a hand through her hair. "No!" she shouted louder than she meant to. "No," more quietly now. "No vet. We just gotta drag it off the road." Mentor stepped forward. "Need a hand?" The woman looked at his tall, muscular body, but shook her head. "No, Ments. Look, all of you, just go back to your trucks and wait for my signal. Dad and I'll take care of it." Mentor was unconvinced and he wanted to help. "Your old man couldn't wipe a fly off a windshield. How's he gonna lift a beer?" "What did you say?" "I said, how's he gonna lift a bear? I never said we hit a bear." But for Alice, it was one question too much. "Just do as you're fucking told, okay?" she shouted. Judge immediately mumbled an apology and sidled back to the 18-wheeler. Vincenzo and Sparks hung on and watched in embarrassed silence as Minter tried to understand what was happening. "Listen, Alice," said the big guy reassuringly. "If you're in any kind of trouble, or Mr. Whitney, if any of you need anything, "You'll what?" she cut in. "Hide like you did at Crystal Lake?" "You too, Sparks, Vincenzo. I didn't see any of you running out of your fucking trailers when me and Dad were surrounded by an angry fucking mob." Let me explain," began Minter, but Alice had nailed him, and he seemed to deflate in front of everyone. "Good night, Mint." Alice turned and walked back towards the front of the RV, where her father was searching along the path of the headlamps, trying but failing to find whoever it was they'd knocked down. The old man had been too distressed by the accident to pay attention to her clash with the others. Nevertheless, when Alice glanced over her shoulder and saw Minter, Sparks, and Vincenzo all returning to their trucks, she heaved a sigh of relief. But then she heard a voice. "That's no animal." Kenton Freely stepped out of the shadows. While she'd been fending off the mutiny, he'd snuck down the side of her motorhome, and he had been waiting for her. "Not now, Freely," she slurred. She tried to ignore him and went to join her father a couple of yards in front of the truck. Kenton, however, held back, so that when Alice tried to look at him, she was blinded by the headlamps. "Manslaughter," said Freely with cool insinuation. "That's at least 5 years, my dear." Alice stopped and turned. Her body, still clad in the long floral dress, was caught in the twin floods of the RV. "You know, you look good in lights," Kenton snickered. "Maybe we should start up a new routine. A skin show. What do you think, George?" The old man didn't answer. He was too busy hunting for the inevitable outline of a fallen figure. "I'm talking to you, George," Kenton iterated menacingly. After Crystal Lake, a full bottle of Jack, and now a dead body in the road, Alice was in the perfect mood to take Freely on. She shielded her eyes against the beams of the truck and walked over to square off against the creep. "Freely, why don't you just fuck off back to whatever rat shit stinkhole you come from?" But Freely wasn't going anywhere. He'd been with the Carnival over 30 years, and most of that time he'd lived on Easy Street. The ride would have been as smoother if it wasn't for Whitney's round hill of a daughter growing up and making all kinds of problems for Uncle Kenty. For too long now, Freely had had to bite his lip and let Alice think she got the upper hand. But he'd just been biding his time. He knew the lousy bitch would slip up sooner or later, and tonight, she just slipped up for good. "I don't quite think you understand what's going on here, Alice." His whole attitude was slick with blackmail. "I'm putting you in my pockets, right where you belong." The woman was unimpressed. "Kenton, I could argue with you, we could fight, or I could try to reason with you, but, well, I just don't have the time. You're fucking fired." Freely looked over her shoulder and spoke to the old man. "Is that right, George?" he asked. "Is she firing moi?" Alice didn't know what the lowlife was up to, but suddenly, even through her drunken haze, she could feel the swirling of undercurrents. Kenton was playing some kind of a game involving her father. "George," repeated Kenton, "I said..." But the old man was oblivious to the dynamics of the moment. He simply stared down the road and said almost absent-mindedly, "Go back to your truck, Kenton." Freely took a lungful of air and was about to let loose, when suddenly he fell quiet. Alice could see there was something going on behind his eyes. He was weighing up the odds, wondering whether to go for the big one or not. But what stunt was the bastard going to pull? "Okay, Georgie." Kenton squeezed out a smile to show everyone who was boss. "It'll keep." Then he gave Alice one final stare before slinking back in the direction of the pickup. Alice waited until Kenton was out of sight before going up to her dad. She wanted to ask the old man what was going on between him and Freely, but now was neither the time nor the place. They had to go find the guy that Alice had killed. Glow murmured as she gradually regained a muffled form of consciousness. She needed help. She needed to see a doctor. She needed to go someplace. But why? The girl tried to think. She tried to remember, but the concussion made everything seem distant and fuzzy. She had a vague memory of running away from someone. She was trying to get somewhere. She was trying to get to the road. That was it. She was trying to get to the road because she wanted to get away from someone. But who? Just then she heard two voices, an elderly man and a woman, coming from the blacktop. Glow tried to call for help, but her voice was so pathetic she could barely hear it herself. Haltingly, the girl got up and tried to walk, but almost immediately her head started spinning, and her legs began to give away. She steadied herself against a tall pine, but even that didn't stop vertigo from overwhelming her. The ground swayed and pitched in all directions, and Glow knew she had no chance of making the simple 5 paces back to the asphalt. Out on the road, the old man and the woman continued talking. They had no idea the girl was so close, and as Glow clutched desperately at the tree for support, a bank of clouds scudded across the moon and plunged the frightened teenager into even darker isolation. There! Alice pointed out a shape lying in the road. She had almost completely sobered up at this point, just from the sheer fear of what she had done. She and her father had walked an incredible 50 to 100 yards before finding anything. It didn't seem possible anyone could have been thrown so far. Who is it? George's cane tapped on the pavement as he hurriedly limped along beside his daughter. Alice looked back towards the carnival vehicles. Their headlamps were only just useful at this distance, and now some damn clouds were blocking out the moon. I don't know, she answered, frustrated. It's too dark. Wait! George reached into his jacket pocket. I have my pin torch. Then he hobbled forward and shined the light from his novelty keychain down onto the split hockey mask of Jason Voorhees. The maniac lay in a misshapen tangle on the asphalt and was completely motionless. Oh my God, Jesus! Alice said excitedly. Then she raised a hand to her lips and tried to stifle a spontaneous laugh. Alice, are you insane? Her father was outraged. This is no laughing matter. Pull yourself together, girl. But the woman couldn't stop at all, and very quickly she broke into laughter at the sheer incredulity of it all. Do you know who this is? She spluttered. How could anyone possibly know? Replied her father, his whole body now a mass of anxiety. And what difference does it make? What difference? Woo! She whooped. It makes every damn difference. This is the break we've been waiting for. She grabbed the small flashlight from her father's hand, bent down beside the spread-eagled body, and turned the beam of full onto the hockey mask. Dad, it's Jason Voorhees, the Crystal Lake Killer. We're rich! Glow moved away from the tree and did her best not to trip as she stumbled through the bushes. The girl was still badly disoriented, but she had to get to the road. She had to do something or say something or warn someone about something. It was all muddled up, but she knew she had to go forward. One foot, then another. Glow was only 2 steps away from the sunken verge when she saw the head of Mrs. Voorhees lying on the ground in front of her. And it was then that the clouds parted, throwing moonlight on the head, with all the willful guile of the devil playing dice. Sheriff Haslip was amazed to find himself still hanging around the office. He knew the phone call was a hoax. He'd taken dozens of them over the years, and they were always the same. It was a Crystal Lake tradition. Every summer, the fruitcakes came to town, and suddenly Jason was alive again. Admittedly, the strangling act had been quite convincing, but then, if Carney people couldn't put on a good performance, who could? For the 10th time since taking the call, Haslip kicked himself for misreading Alice so badly. Then he swiveled his chair round to look at the map mounted on the wall behind his desk. The sheriff wasn't born locally, but he'd seen what was left of the old case files, so he knew where the murders were supposed to have taken place. Surprise, surprise, he muttered. The road nearest to the abandoned camp just happened to be the one he'd sent the carnival along. It was definitely time to call it a day. The sheriff crossed the room, flicked the light switch, and walked out of the building. But back inside, the map on the wall stubbornly refused to comply with Haslip's cynicism. The old camp, the roads, the lake, all these places were clearly marked as undeniable facts. Just think about it. Alice spread her hands as if delineating a new banner over the gateway to the show. Dr. Geistman's Carnival of Terror, featuring the body of Jason Voorhees.
"This is lunacy,"
gasped her father.
"If what you said is true, Voorhees would have to be 60 years old. The police would have caught him long before now."
The old man's logic sent an uppercut crashing into his daughter's jaw, but she was already feeling punchy from the whiskey she'd knocked back. "I don't know," she griped. "I'm not a fucking expert, but if some jerk goes stomping around Crystal Lake in a fucking hockey mask, that'll do it for me."
"You're not making sense, child,"
the old man protested. His fear-fractured mind could not understand how the scenario had shifted 180, from the two of them needing to save a casualty's life, or at the very least facing a prison sentence, to suddenly seeing this disaster as the salvation of the show, an opportunity lined with nothing but hot, fat greenbacks. "I got it all worked out." Alice was almost breathless with excitement. "It's like you say, no one thinks he's real, so no one will miss him."
"But surely you intend to report this to the authorities."
It seemed to Whitney that the nightmare was growing in madness, and it was, because as the clouds sailed clear of the moon, neither George nor his daughter noticed Jason sitting up behind them. The voices had grown louder, not because Glow was any closer. Truth was, she hadn't moved an inch since finding the head, but because the people who were talking had just started to shout. Glow stared forward through the trees. Her concentration was shot, and her vision kept going in and out of focus. But she could just make out this crazy farm woman, giving a hard time to some dapper old guy leaning on a walking stick. "We can have him, ready for tomorrow's show," the woman shouted.
"Alice, I forbid it!"
The old man tried to sound equally angry, but was cut short by a coughing fit.
"We need to call the police. Maybe Sheriff Haslip."
"Forget it, Dad. Jason's our property now." Jason? The name echoed and rebounded through the cobwebs of Glow's mind, distorting and resounding in an opera of blood-stained mortality. Jason. Jason. Jason! She gasped, and she looked over to see the supermaniac sitting upright in the road. He was getting ready to kill and kill again, and the two poor bastards standing right beside him were too caught up in their bitching to realize they were already dead. Glow raised her arms and tried to cry out, but she barely managed a whisper before nausea overtook her, and she dropped to her knees. A second later, and she slumped forward, her breast landing on the severed head of Pamela Voorhees and canceling out the moonlight. Without making a single sound, Jason's upper body fell back down onto the asphalt, and he was immobile once more. Though every fiber of common sense shouted at him to walk away, George was gradually coming around to Alice's way of thinking. He had had too much of the showman in his blood, and he didn't want Alice to know it. But his main worry now was making sure they wouldn't be caught.
"But what of the others?" he whispered. "What if they've heard anything?"
Alice shrugged. "What'll they do? Can us and cut off their dreams? I don't think so."
"Well, why don't we leave him here?"
The old man felt compelled to play devil's advocate.
"Go on and call from a phone booth. That way, they won't be able to trace us and you won't have to go to prison."
But Alice could see right through him. "Dad, look. The kids will do whatever we tell them. We're so fucking under the radar. If any one of them goes to the cops with some story about kidnapping Jason's body, they'll laugh him all the way to the nut house."
"And they'd be right to laugh," said her father stubbornly. "This man can't possibly be Jason Voorhees."
"Well, whoever he is," Alice could tell she was almost home. "Fact, fiction, or phony, he's part of the show now." George tapped his foot on the hard surface of the road. He was undecided. Neither of them had seen Jason sit up and sit back down again. They were totally unaware of the danger they were about to try to deal with. So for now, there was only one more test the old man could think of.
"Are you certain he's dead?"
he asked timorously. Alice laughed, knowing what was coming. "Oh, and I wonder who's the only one here trained in first aid."
"Well, I wasn't going to say anything,"
added George with a twinkle in his eye. And just for the slightest moment, father and daughter shared in the warmth of good, honest humor. Alice took a moment to prepare, and then passed Whitney the pen torch. "Here, hold this while I lift the mask." George took the light and tried to keep it steady as she knelt down on the road. She paused for a moment. Then she placed her fingers on the white plastic of the immortal face shield and slowly, ever slowly, removed the puck guard from Jason's head. Christ! The one word was so understated that George couldn't resist taking a look for himself.
"Good Lord!"
he gasped. Alice looked up. "Still want to check for a pulse?" Glow tried to move. She tried to get up and made every effort to call out, but she was too far gone, still lying sprawled over the head of Mrs. Voorhees. The young girl from Seattle slipped irresistibly into the comfort of sleep. George lent moral support while Alice dragged Jason back towards the RV. She locked her hands under Jason's shoulders and was struggling to pull him inch by sweaty, grunting inch. Jason's boots scraped noisily against the stony surface.
"Almost there,"
said the old man, rounding the sentence off with a couple of loud coughs, as if to remind Alice of his unsuitability for physical exercise. The woman shot him a dirty look and wrestled Jason's bulk up on board the trailer. As she laid the killer out along the central aisle, her father resumed his place in the front passenger seat. The old man was flooded with doubt, and yet there was something irresistible about his daughter's proposition. His mind suddenly flashed back to the video image of Jaomi Morantes with a hockey mask on her face and stage blood on her breasts. But just as swiftly he blanked his impulse and put the dark side of his imagination back in the cage where it belonged. The last time George Arthur Whitney had given full vent to his baser instincts, it had ended in disaster. Alice flopped into the driver's seat beside him. For the first time in a long time, she felt almost optimistic. She'd successfully taken control of the show, and she'd just hired its new star attraction. If her dad ever complained, she'd just remind him he was party to an unreported manslaughter, and that, if she went down, he'd join her and would never smell the flowers again. No, for once things were positively looking up. But then Alice didn't know that Kenton Freely had been hiding in the darkness, and had seen and heard everything. Shortly, the carnival was once more on the move. One by one, the 4 trucks started their engines, and one by one they rolled past the broken pieces of hockey mask still lying in the road. Okay, this has been Chapter 6 of Friday the 13th Carnival of Maniacs. And I gotta say, a lot went down in this chapter tonight. We got a better look at the rock star, Nosferatu. We got some more insight into Alice and George's father-daughter relationship. We figured out what the power that keeps Jason alive is. Apparently the moonlight hitting Pamela's face brought him back to life and then put him back out when she was covered up. So I'm curious to see what exactly happens when Glow wakes up and the moonlight hits the head again. You know, what's going to happen with Jason in this carnival? What's Freely going to do since he was eavesdropping there and heard everything George and his daughter were talking about? Things are getting a lot better in this book. I've enjoyed it so far. I don't think there's much in the story so far that I haven't enjoyed. And I love the fact that there was a callback to Tommy Jarvis. There was a callback to Freddy versus Jason. I think the author of this book did a good job of staying true to the lore. Anyways, guys, let me know what you thought of tonight's chapter and what you think of the book in general. And I'll be back very soon with more of Friday the 13th Carnival of Maniacs. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening. And if ever you accidentally run into a horror icon, don't call the cops, don't hide the body, Just chain that body up, slap it into a freak show, and watch the money come rolling in. 'Cause nothing bad could ever happen in that scenario, right? Have a good night, everybody.